She was the queen of jazz, writer, an American icon, the one and only Ella Fitzgerald. I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. Continuing now with the story and the wonderful career of Ella Fitzgerald. And I'm going to pick it up from where she had recorded the Porter, the Cole Porter songbook. So I'm just give you a brief reminder and then I'll go on and bring you up to speed. So let's get right down to Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald Sings, the Cole Porter songbook released in 1956, was the first of 8 songbook sets. Fitzgerald would record for Verve at irregular intervals from 1956 to 1964. The composer and lyricist spotlighted on each set taken together represents the greatest part of the cultural canon known as the Great American Songbook. Her song selections range from standards to rarities and represented an attempt by Fitzgerald to cross over to a non-jazz audience. The sets are the most well-known items in her discography. Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Duke Ellington songbook was the only songbook on which the composer she interpreted played with her. Duke Ellington and his longtime collaborator, Billy Strayhorn, both appeared on exactly half of the set's 38 tracks and wrote 2 new pieces of music for the album. The E and D Blues and a 4-movement musical portrait of Fitzgerald. The songbook series ended up becoming the singer's most critically acclaimed and commercially successful work, and probably her most significant offering to American culture. The New York Times wrote in 1996, these albums are among the first pop records to devote such serious attention to individual songwriters, and they were instrumental in establishing the pop album as a vehicle for serious musical exploration. Days after Fitzgerald's death, the New York Times columnist Frank Rich wrote that in the songbook series, Fitzgerald performed a cultural transaction as extraordinary as Elvis's contemporaneous integration of white and African American soul. Here was a black woman popularizing urban songs often written by immigrant Jews to a national audience of predominantly white Christians. Frank Sinatra, out of respect for Fitzgerald, prohibited Capitol Records from releasing his own recordings in separate albums for individual composers in the same way. Fitzgerald also recorded albums exclusively devoted to the songs of Porter and Gershwin in 1972 and 1993. The albums being respectively Ella Loves Cole and Nice Work If You Can Get It. A later collection devoted to a single composer was released during her time with Pablo Records, Ella Abraca Joblin, featuring the songs of Antonio Carroza Jobim. While recording the songbooks and the occasional studio album, Fitzgerald toured 40 to 45 weeks per year in the United States and internationally. Under the tutelage of Norman Granz, Grants helped solidify her position as one of the leading live jazz performers. In 1961, Fitzgerald bought a house in the Klampenborg district of Copenhagen, Denmark, after she began a relationship with a Danish man. Though the relationship ended after a year, Fitzgerald regularly returned to Denmark over the next 3 years and even considered buying a jazz club there. The house was sold in 1963 and Fitzgerald permanently returned to the United States. There are several live albums on Verve that are highly regarded by critics. At the Opera House shows a typical jazz at the Philharmonic set from Fitzgerald. Ella in Rome and the 12 Nights in Hollywood display her vocal jazz canon. Ella in Berlin is still one of her best-selling albums. It includes a Grammy-winning performance of Mac the Knife, in which she forgets the lyrics but improvises to compensate. Verve Records was sold to MGM in 1960 for $3 million, and in 1967, MGM failed to renew Fitzgerald's contract. Over the next 5 years, she fitted it between Atlantic, Capitol, and Reprise. Her material at this time represented a departure from a typical jazz repertoire. For Capitol, she recorded Bright in the Corner, an album of hymns, Ella Fitzgerald's Christmas, an album of traditional Christmas carols, Misty Blue, a country and western influenced album, and 30 by Ella, a series of 6 medleys that fulfilled her obligations for the label. During this period, she had her last U.S. chart single with the cover of Smokey Robinson's Get Ready, previously a hit for The Temptations and some months later a top 5 hit for Rare Earth. The surprise success of the 1972 album Jazz at Santa Monica Civic 72 led Grants to found Pablo Records, his first record label since the sale of Verve. Fitzgerald recorded some 20 albums for the label. Ella in London recorded live in 1974 with pianist Tommy Flanagan. Guitarists Jorge Paz, bassist Carter Betts, and drummer Bobby Durham was considered by many to be some of her best work. The following year, she again performed with Jose or Joe Pass on German television station NDR in Hamburg. Her years with Pablo Records also documented the decline in her voice. She frequently used shorter, stabbing phrases, and her voice was harder with a wider vibrato. One biographer wrote, "Plagued by health problems, Fitzgerald, her last recording in 1991 and her last performances in 1993. Also, Ella starred in film and television. In her most notable screen role, Fitzgerald played the part of singer Maggie Jackson in Jack Webb's 1955 jazz film Pete Kelly Blues. The film co-starred Janet Leigh and singer Peggy Lee. Even though she had already worked in the movies, she sang 2 songs in the 1942 Abbott and Costello film Ride 'em Cowboy. She was delighted when Norman Granz negotiated the role for her, and at the time considered her role in the Warner Brothers movie the biggest thing ever to have happened to me. Amid the New York Times span of the film when it opened in August 1955, the reviewer wrote, about 5 minutes out of 95 suggest the picture this might have been. Take the ingenious prologue, or take the fleeting scenes, when the wonderful Ella Fitzgerald, alluded a few lines, fills the screen and soundtrack with her strong mobile features and voice. After Pete Kelly Blues, she appeared in sporadic movie cameos in St. Louis Blues, 1958, and Let No Man Write My Epitaph in 1960. She made numerous guest appearances on television shows, singing on The Frank Sinatra Show, The Carol Burnett Show, The Andy Williams Show, The Pat Booney Chevrolet Showroom, and alongside other greats Nat King Cole, Dean Martin, Mel Torme, and many others. She was also frequently featured on The Ed Sullivan Show. Perhaps her most unusual and intriguing performance was of the Three Little Maids song from Gilbert and Sullivan's comic operetta, The Mikado, alongside Joan Sutherland and Diana Shore on Show's weekly variety series in 1963. A performance at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London was filmed and shown on the BBC or the British Broadcasting Corporation. Fitzgerald also made a one-off appearance alongside Sarah Vaughan and Pearl Bailey on a 1979 television special honoring Bailey. In 1980, she performed a medley of standards in a duet with Karen Carpenter on the Carpenters television special Music, Music, Music. Fitzgerald also appeared in TV commercials, her most memorable being an ad for Memorex. In the commercials, she sang a note that shattered a glass while being recorded on a Memorex cassette tape. The tape was played back, and the recording also broke another glass, asking, "Is it live or is it Memorex?" She also appeared in a number of commercials for Kentucky Fried Chicken, singing and scanting to the fast food chain's longtime slogan, "We do chicken right." Her last commercial campaign was for American Express, in which she was photographed by Annie pardon me, I apologize. It's been a long day, y'all. Her last commercial campaign was for American Express, in which she was photographed by Annie Leibovitz. Ella Fitzgerald, Just One of Those Things, is a film about her life, including interviews with many famous singers and musicians who worked with her and her son. It was directed by Leslie Woodhead and produced by Reggie Nadelson. It was released in the UK in 2019. Also, Ella Fitzgerald did many collaborations. Fitzgerald's most famous collaborations were with the vocal quartet Bill and Kenny and the Ink Spots, trumpeter Louis Armstrong, the guitarist Joe Pass, and the band leaders Count Basie and Duke Ellington. From 1943 to 1950, Fitzgerald recorded 7 songs with the Ink Spots featuring Bill Kenny. One of the 7, 4 reached the top pop charts, including I'm Making Believe and Into Each Life Some Rain Must Fall, which both reached number 1. Fitzgerald recorded 3 Verve studio albums with Louis Armstrong, 2 albums of standards, 1956's Ella and Louis and 1957's Ella and Louis Again, and a 3rd album featured music from the Gershwin opera, Porgy and Bess. Fitzgerald also recorded a number of sides with Armstrong for Decca in the early 1950s. Fitzgerald is sometimes referred to as the quintessential swing singer, and her meetings with Count Basie are highly regarded by critics. Fitzgerald features on one track of Basie's 1957 album 1 O'Clock Jump, while her 1963 album Ella and Basie is remembered as one of her greatest recordings, with the New Testament Basie Band in full swing and arrangements written by a young Quincy Jones. This album proved a respite from the songbook recordings and constant touring that Fitzgerald was engaged in during this period. Fitzgerald and Basie also collaborated on the 1972 album Jazz at Santa Monica Civic 72, and on the 1979 albums Digital 3 at Montreux, a classy pair and a perfect match. Fitzgerald and Joe Pass recorded 4 albums together toward the end of Fitzgerald's career. She recorded several albums with piano accompaniment, but a guitar proved the perfect melodic foil for her. Fitzgerald and Pass appeared together on the albums Take Love Easy, 1973, Easy Living, 1986, Speak Love, 1983, and Fitzgerald and Pass Again in 1976. Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington recorded 2 live albums and 2 studio albums. Her Duke Ellington songbook placed Ellington firmly in the canon known as the Great American Songbook, and the 1960s saw Fitzgerald and the Duke meet on the Côte d'Azur for the 1966 album Ellen and Duke at the Côte d'Azur, and in Sweden for the Stockholm concert 1966. The 1956 album Ella at Duke's Place is also extremely well received. Fitzgerald had a number of famous jazz musicians and soloists as sidemen over her long career: the trumpeters Roy Eldridge and Dizzy Gillespie, the guitarist Herb Ellis, and the pianist Tommy Flanagan, Oscar Peterson, Lou Levy, Paul Smith, Jimmy Rose, and Ellis Larkins all worked with Fitzgerald mostly in live small group settings. Possibly Fitzgerald's greatest unrealized collaboration in terms of popular music was a studio or live album with Frank Sinatra. The two appeared on the same stage only periodically over the years in television specials in 1956 and in 1958 and 1959, and again on 1967's A Man in His Music, plus Ella plus Jobim, a show that also featured Antonio Carlos Jobim. Pianist Paul Smith has said, Ella loved working with Frank Sinatra, gave her dressing room on A Man and His Music, and couldn't do enough for her. When asked, Norman Granz would cite complex contractual reasons for the fact that the two artists never recorded together. Fitzgerald's appearances with Frank Sinatra and Count Basie in June 1974 for a series of concerts at Caesars Palace, Las Vegas, was seen as an important incentive for Sinatra to return from his self-imposed retirement of the early 1970s. The shows were a great success, and September 1975 saw them gross $1 million in 2 weeks on Broadway in a triumvirate with the Count Basie Orchestra. Sadly, Fitzgerald suffered from diabetes for several years of her later life, which had led to numerous complications. In 1985, Fitzgerald was hospitalized briefly for respiratory problems, in 1986 for congestive heart failure, and in 1990 for exhaustion. In March 1990, she appeared at the Royal Albert Hall in London, England, with the Count Basie Orchestra, for the launch of Jazz FM, plus a gala dinner at the Grosvenor House Hotel, at which she performed. In 1993, she had to have both of her legs amputated below the knee due to the effects of diabetes. Her eyesight was affected as well. She died in her home from a stroke on June 15th, 1996, at the age of 79. A few hours after her death, the Playboy Jazz Festival was launched at the Hollywood Bowl. In tribute, the marquee read, "Ella, we will miss you." Her funeral was private, and she was buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California. I'm Tyrone Bowman. To be continued. Never surrender. Never